anytime you have a group of people, there's bound to be some sort of conflict, especially when you're striving to achieve excellence. People are going to want to change things that other people don't see the value of changing. People are striving to improve things and other people don't understand the potential for improvement, or maybe there's some disagreement specifically about whether the improvement will yield the benefits that one party thinks it'll yield. So in any organization, there's some sort of rules about how to gain agreement, about how to resolve conflict. Most organizations, that's part of what the chain of command's about. You kind of send the conflict up the chain of command, and there's a decider that's somewhere above you, and I imagine there's some sort of very rigid rules about, depending on the size of the conflict, how high up the ladder it goes. In Morningstar, we don't have a high structural hierarchy that is designed in order to resolve those conflicts. We have to have a different process, a way of doing it. So one of our principles, it's a stated principle, it's part of the kind of constitution of Morningstar. One of our principles is called gaining agreement, conflict resolution, direct communication. And the whole idea is that if there's a conflict between two people, the most efficient and effective way for that conflict to be resolved is for the two parties to get together and to work to resolve that conflict individually without anybody else having to be involved. That's step one. If you have a difference of opinion, if you have a conflict with someone, you're expected to go to that person directly and attempt to resolve the conflict by coming to agreement. You don't get to shuffle it off to someone else and have them make the decision. You own it. Practically speaking, though, you can't always gain agreement one-to-one. Sometimes the conflict is too big, or quite frankly, in all honesty, many times the circumstances surrounding the difference of opinion are kind of ambiguous. And so you're left with, okay, we want to resolve these differences in the most efficient way possible, which is directly, one person to another person. But if you can't, then you get a third party. That's step two. You get a third party, any third party that both of you trust and believe can add some value. Now, this third party, this next step, it's not that they're going to be a judge and they're going to decide which party is right. We get a third party involved because hopefully that third party can add some insight, add some perspective, maybe provide some alternative courses of action that will work out to a meaningful compromise for the two parties. But if that third party can't help the two conflicting parties reach an agreement, we go to the next step of the process, which is you bring a panel of colleagues in. And again, this panel is not a jury. This panel's job is not to decide the issue. Their job is to, again, provide greater insight, more insight. Again, with the idea that hopefully the two parties can reach agreement through having kind of a multitude of wisdom in the room. Panel can be 6 to 10 colleagues who both of the initial parties agree can provide some insight, provide value. And again, you bring them into the room. They're sitting there in the room with the two original parties plus the third party, and they go through the entire issue, the entire point of conflict. And hopefully, in an ideal world, at that point, barring all else, we can achieve some sort of resolution. Practically speaking, though, even when we get to that point, there are some times where we can't achieve resolution. And the final step in the process at Morningstar is that Morningstar's legal president, who's still our owner, will get involved and he will join the panel. He'll attempt to help find a resolution. And I think it's really critical to understand that he has always and still continues to perceive his role first and foremost as a protector of our principles, as kind of a protector of our Constitution. He sees his role in the process as less about being a final decision maker and more about making sure we are doing everything possible to find the truth. In fact, I think it's important that you understand that this whole process is aimed at finding the truth. One of our other principles is that we should be constantly seeking to find the truth. We're trying to do what's right. So what kind of difference, what kind of conflict can this process be used for? The truth of the matter is it's any conflict, any difference of opinion. From something as small as what sort of supply should we be using in the factory, all the way to do you need to be working at this company? We don't have nobody in the company has the unilateral right to fire anybody else. And that's kind of a result of the fact that we don't have a structural, formal hierarchy. At the same time, though, anybody has the right to ask somebody else to leave. And that may seem like a nuance, but practically speaking, it's one of the things we hold very dear within the enterprise. Because frankly, being asked to leave, it's a big deal. But assuming we have tried to resolve whatever the conflict or the difference of opinion is, and we're at the point where we're asking me, for example, to leave, I may have a difference of opinion with you. That may be a point of conflict. And practically speaking, it sometimes is, although surprisingly, not always. Sometimes, the person being asked to leave agrees that I'm just not fit for this organization, for this role, for what we're doing here. So to the degree, though, that there's a difference of opinion there when I'm being asked to leave, the same steps of the same process hold true. We're simply trying to find the truth and come to agreement. We're trying to find some sort of terms that allow us to come to a resolution that we can all agree on. We go through the same steps of the process, and interestingly, sometimes those steps can yield outcomes that neither of the original two parties thought possible. For example, someone comes to me and says, Paul, we've tried to work through this performance issue that you seem to have, and we haven't been able to reconcile and resolve it. I just don't think you belong here. And I disagree, and so we bring in a third party, and we bring in a panel. Sometimes it comes to, maybe there's a different place where you can fit in the organization, Paul. And that's a reasonable outcome. It's important to know that this is not an appeal process. It's not as if a decision is made and then it's sent up to a higher body that is an appeals body. This is an escalation. We can't figure it out. We can't reach agreement at this one-to-one level, so let's pull somebody else in and see if we can then. And if we can't, then let's pull some more people in and see if we can. One of the things we're asked quite often is, how many times does this happen? What are the numbers? What are the metrics? And the fact that it's direct, one person to another, means that quite often people will have a conflict, a difference of opinion. They need to get agreement on something, and they'll do it directly, and that's the end of the situation. There's no formal record of it. There's no file kept about it, and because agreement was reached. So we don't really have a clear sense of how often that happens. Statistically speaking, anecdotally, it happens all the time, every day, multiple times, hundreds, probably thousands of times over the course of any given work week in Morningstar. And I can't say that we have a clear sense of how often it escalates up to the second or third step, although it's increasingly more and more rare. Practically, that final step in the process where the president, Chris Rufer, gets involved, it happens maybe 10, 12 times a year. So it's not very frequently that the process escalates up to that point. And generally when it does, it's either about some big difference of opinion that is, potentially earth-shattering, or somebody being asked to leave, which is a very, very big and heavy issue. So at some level, I think a lot of people think this seems like an arduous process or maybe a little bit time-consuming. And practically speaking, it's generally not, because most things get resolved at a one-to-one level, just like you do in your normal everyday life. But to the degree that we're talking about something really big that we can't reach agreement on, yeah, it can take some time. But we think it's worth it, because we feel like it's important that anybody who might have some meaningful insight or significant expertise in the area that we're trying to reach an agreement about should really be involved in that process. And it shouldn't be arbitrarily, somebody up the chain of command making a decision if that person is not the best person to make the decision. We should have the people in the room who need to be in the room in order to help us figure out what is the thing we should be doing. So we've always felt like it's worth the time, it's worth the energy up front to ensure that we make the best possible decision, because in the long term we'll be better off for investing the time and energy up front.